hate-based crimes could become jailable offences and land you behind bars. The historic Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill, which was passed in Parliament this month, effectively protects people against crimes that are based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and other forms of discrimination. Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered with me, Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. The law also covers posts made on social media, including Twitter, Facebook, and WhatsApp. But there are concerns from some quarters, including religious organizations, that the law could criminalize free speech, infringing on human rights. So tonight we ask, will the new hate crimes and hate speech bill address deep prejudice in South Africa? To explore this debate, we welcome the Deputy Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development, John Jeffrey, a key figure behind the bill. Remember to join in this discussion on X using our handle @Unfiltered SABC. Deputy Minister, thank you very much for joining us. This is a fascinating and important development in South Africa, given our history of racial hate crimes. Take us through the genesis of this bill and how it has come to this point of near finality.
Yeah, the only thing that's left is the signature by the President, presidential assent. But good evening, thanks for inviting me, Sizwe, and good evening to the viewers. Look, this bill's been in the pipeline for a long time.
Sure.
It started off just as a bill on hate crimes, but then, which I found being processed when I came into office, which was 10 years ago. But then in the last administration, that was with Mike Masuta as minister, at that time there were a lot of racial insults being made, offensive racial statements. And the view was, look, we can't just restrict it to hate crimes, we need to include hate speech. Originally there was a reluctance to include hate speech because of the whole issue of freedom of speech. A bill was then published by the department for public comment. There was a lot of response, or the main response was from religious groupings, faith-based organizations, which I think were mostly concerned about the issue of homophobia and could they say homophobic things. Then the bill was revised. There was then a higher bar put in for proselytizing of religious tenets. And then it went to Parliament. It got introduced in 2018. It had to wait for the Kwelane judgment on homophobia, which came out in 2021. And then the work really started on the bill. And it took, I think, a year with the Justice Portfolio Committee in the National Assembly, went to the National Council of Provinces, and then they finished with it, and it then had to have the amendments confirmed by the National Assembly, which was on, I think, Tuesday, the 4th of December this year.
Indeed, and it's an important development for a country still dealing with deep racial and other identity-related divides. And interesting in some ways that we haven't had a bill like this for so long. But of course, that constitutional process also took a long time. Take us through the objects of this bill and what it seeks to do, and also what it doesn't seek to do, because there's been some public debate about the bill, which in some ways has been a bit hysterical. Yeah,
no, I'd agree with that. Look, it criminalizes hate crimes and hate speech. A hate crime is a normal crime that gets committed because of a motive of the person's prejudice against a person because of the particular characteristics that they have, and the bill lists then 16 characteristics, which is quite a wide range. Sure. You can go through the list if you want. So you'd have your ordinary crime, but it becomes a hate crime if you can prove that motive, and that makes it a more serious crime. So you can assault somebody, that's just assault, but if you assault them because you don't like their race, their religion, their sexual orientation, those kinds of things, then it can become a hate crime. Hate speech then is basically a smaller list, but it's basically that you can't say things that are harmful or promote harm and promote hatred. And that's a smaller list because we were very careful about the issue of freedom of speech. Sure. There is a balance, obviously, between freedom of speech is not absolute. It's got to be measured against other rights, like the right to dignity. So that's the hate speech provision. There is then a higher bar for artistic expression, reporting, scientific and academic writing, and then proselytizing, preaching religious tenets. And there you can't, what you say can't constitute incitement to cause harm. So for everybody else, you can't say something which is harmful and promotes hatred. But if you're proselytizing in church or going door to door, you can't say something that incites harm against a group of people. There's also provisions then for the Commission of Police, for the National Director of Public Prosecutions, to set out guidelines about the investigation and the prosecution, the withdrawal of cases. There's provisions for the South African Human Rights Commission, the Gender Commission, or Commission for Gender Equality, and the Commission for Cultural and Religious and Linguistic Rights to also be involved in preventing hate speech and hate crimes. This bill is not the solution to racism in South Africa. We're not going to, if you take racism, we're not going to overcome racism while there's so much inequality on the basis of race in terms of particularly employment, education, wealth, those kinds of things.
Sure.
But this is sort of really the stick part of it, and then there's other programs and processes that need to be followed to try and promote inclusivity in South African society. We're a diverse society. We need to accept each other's differences and respect them. Absolutely,
and I think there is a lot of support for government getting more serious about people who say overtly and egregiously hateful things, especially when it comes to the past divisions in our society around race, but of course around a wide range of identity markers. Legally speaking, of course, there are already ways of holding people accountable. And so I wonder what you think this does in addition to things like crimen injuria, for example, on the one hand. Of course, there's just the usual assault and those kind of things. Why do you think that there's a need to have something in addition to what the common law and other statutes provide for that goes that extra step further?
Look, as I said, there's two parts. The hate crimes aspect, which are existing crimes, and it's more ensuring that there's a more severe penalty, also that there can be a recording of those crimes, because not much is being done to record those crimes at present.
Sure.
The more controversial one is obviously the hate speech provisions. There, what we've got in our existing law is PROPUDA, the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, which enables you to go, if you feel your rights to equality have been violated, and there's a whole set of grounds in that act, you can go to the Equality Court. And that's, for example, where the Kwelane matter came from.
Sure.
He was taken to court by the South African Human Rights Commission. So that is a remedy, but it's a civil remedy. So it's basically up to the individual to take the matter to the Equality Court. There's no responsibility on the state, and there's no criminal punishment. So the view was that the state needs to have responsibilities to act against racism. It shouldn't just, or racism or any of the other categories that I've raised. It shouldn't just be up to the individual to have to take the trouble to go to court and get help. In the Kwelane matter, that was the Human Rights Commission. In the Masuku matter, that was also the Human Rights Commission assisting the Jewish Board of Deputies. So that's the civil thing, but the idea is for the state to have responsibility as a crime. You can, if somebody beats you up, you can sue them, but it's a crime, and therefore the state becomes responsible for ensuring prosecution. There is an existing crime of crimen injuria, as you'd said. The problem with that is that's a common law crime. So it's developed, it's an old Roman Dutch crime, it's developed by the courts. We felt we haven't replaced crimen injuria or tried to abolish it, but we felt there needed to be a statutory crime. That's a law passed by Parliament, setting out the elements of hate speech. Some of the aspects of crimen injuria is, if you look at the textbooks, it's meant to be against an individual. So if you do a Vicky Momberg and you insult two traffic cops specifically, that's crimen injuria.
Sure.
But it's a little bit grayer if it's an issue of you make a generally broad racist statement generally against a particular group of people. So that's the reasoning for having a new statutory crime.
Well, it would seem if any country is going to have a law like this, South Africa would be the prime example. I wonder to what extent you looked at international best practice and other examples around the world, societies maybe like Germany or other places where speech has this, in some ways, disproportionate impact because of history, and have drawn on those international examples.
Yeah, look, there was a lot of international comparisons done. It has become a bone of contention in the deliberations on the bill, with some parties saying, no, this is in contradiction to international law. But that's not the case. I just want to quote sort of two quotes from the Koilani judgment, Justice Majid, on the issue. And he spoke about the right to freedom of expression in international law contains two parts. The first imposes on states the obligation to protect the right to free speech, which is what everybody speaks about. But then he says the second makes it equally mandatory for states to prohibit free speech. And then he makes another comment later on in the judgment saying that the emphasis a society places on freedom of expression and approach to hate speech regulation is largely a product of that society's culture, history, values, and norms. This is an important insight when considering how each jurisdiction aims to reconcile the tension between freedom of expression and hate speech. And I think what's important with that quotation is that what a society, what a country sees as hate speech depends on their historical conditions. So obviously with Germany and the Holocaust, which didn't just mainly kill Jews, but didn't just kill Jews, it was the Roma, Polish, Soviet prisoners, and gay men, Jehovah's Witnesses. But because of the Holocaust, the Germans are very sensitive to people denying the Holocaust, and that is a crime. Yeah. That's obviously a product of their history.
Absolutely.
So the international comparisons are important, but each country comes from a different background.
Right. Let's go to a break. We're discussing a new bill which is before the President, which has made its way through the parliamentary process around criminalizing hate crimes and hate speech, specifically around things like racism or homophobia. We're in discussion with Deputy Minister John Jeffrey about the bill, its objects, and when we come back from the break, we'll look at some of the objections to the bill and hear his responses. Stick with us.
Late Edition covers news from across the country and further afield, reflecting the events of the day while keeping you abreast with the latest news. Led by anchors who guide viewers through triumphs and tragedies alike. Late Edition from 9 p.m. until midnight every night.
Welcome back to Unfiltered. A historic piece of legislation has made its way through Parliament. This is a bill which criminalizes hate crimes. In our country's history of particularly racial division, many people have felt that there hasn't been the appropriate mechanism to hold racial hate crimes accountable, and this is government's attempt to do that. Deputy Minister Jeffrey, of course, there have been objections to this bill, not only its spirit, but also in practice. And let's come to the first main objection, which is that it would infringe on free speech unduly. We've heard this from many quarters. It's part of the reason why parties like the DA voted against the bill. Does this bill infringe on free speech unduly?
I don't think, well, I think the key word is unduly. It obviously does limit speech. But I don't think it unduly limits speech. It's quite carefully crafted to ensure that people who are saying hateful things that cause harm, I mean, you've seen, for example, on social media, when some of these comments have been made, and you know, there's a lot of responses. And the reason for the bill is there must be some form of accountability. Obviously, with free speech, it's not an absolute right on its own. It's got to be limited by other rights as well, and in particular, the rights to human dignity. So the person who's getting insulted, or the group that's getting insulted, have the right to have their dignity respected. So that's the sort of balance. So I think it's quite carefully crafted not to unduly restrict free speech. Also, just to say that the decision to prosecute has to be taken by the Director of Public Prosecutions. That's the head of the NPA for each province. They can delegate it, but it's actually they that have the power. So the idea is that I can't say something against you on a group, whatever group I want to insult that you belong to, and you then rush off to the police station and get me charged, and I get locked up and held in custody. It's got to be a decision from a senior prosecutor as to whether I should be prosecuted or not. So that's also to try and limit it. Maybe just to say also, in the introduction you spoke about imprisonment. We're not really with hate speech wanting to go for imprisonment. It's there as an option.
Right.
Obviously the idea is to correct. But if it's not correctable, like for example in the case of Vicky Momberg, where I think the court found her as just not seeing that she'd done anything wrong, then it threw the book at her and sentenced her to 2 years imprisonment.
In terms of some of the practicalities of the bill, I suppose one of the difficult things with an action like this is when you make a long list of the different kinds of offences. Are you worried that, or do you think that the bill is flexible enough to find new ways or new offences that may emerge in the future? Is that something that can be handled with amendment? I'm
not sure if I'm following you in that hate crime is any offence, but the motive must be one of prejudice. Right. On the listed character grounds. Right. Sorry, that's what I meant. Rather the character grounds. Yeah. No, look, things have changed. I mean, in the Constitution, when it was passed in 1996, it was very few grounds. I think it was on the basis of gender, race, things like that, religion. Papuda, the Equality Act, brought in new ones. It brought in sexual orientation. It widened it quite a bit. They later amended, or Parliament later amended Papuda to provide for HIV and AIDS status being a prohibited ground. They also then amended the definition of sex to include intersex. This bill, in terms of the grounds for hate speech, would include issues such as albinism, and that's because, or people with albinism, that's because people with albinism are vulnerable. And if you have people promoting being harmful to them, promoting hatred against them, it could have dire consequences. So I imagine that there may be other grounds that come in. We did debate, for example, should HIV and AIDS status still be a ground for hate speech? People were killed because of their HIV status a number of years ago. That stigma hopefully has reduced, but we kept it in for a safety measure, but it may be that it becomes less of a stigma and it can come out and other grounds can be added. But it's basically an amendment to the bill, so it's ordinary legislation that can amend the bill.
Interestingly, there also have been objections, not necessarily on free speech grounds, but because people want to be able to say these kind of things or defend people who want to be able to say these kind of things. It's curious, but talk us through some of those objections, because we have heard both on the religious front but also on the political front. It seems to be that there is a move in South Africa. It's a minority move, but people want these words and these acts to be available options.
Yeah, I don't know why. Look, when it came to the vote in the National Assembly and also in the NCOP, there were four parties that opposed the bill. It was the Democratic Alliance, the Freedom Front Plus, the ACDP, and Al Jama. Now, the DA could be, they have some kind of a liberal tradition, so it could have been on the free speech issue, but also Penny Sparrow was a DA branch member. Freedom Front Plus, I don't think, has any liberal tradition. They came from right-wing Afrikaners who opposed the National Party for giving too much away in terms of political reforms. So I think my sense is that their concern is members or supporters who may say racist things, particularly against black people. And, you know, the question is, as you said, why should they be able to? Why do people have to say harmful things about the groups that somebody belongs to? You know, and it's not just race, it's also religion, it's migrancy status. So if you start saying things about immigrants that can cause hatred and are harmful, you could be getting yourself into trouble as well. Asylum seekers are included in that as well. So it's quite a wide range. The other category then is ACDP and a lot of the, some faith-based organizations, and their concern, as far as I can see, and there were a lot of engagements with them, and it was specifically on the issue of homophobia. And from a Christian perspective, being able to preach verses of the Bible, particularly one from Leviticus, which says if a man has sex with another man, they must be put to death. Now, that's in Leviticus. But in that same chapter of Leviticus, there's a provision that if people commit adultery, they must be put to death. Now, that seems to have passed into disuse.
Not quite as popular as the
well, no, I haven't heard people saying that this is such a huge crime. That same chapter of Leviticus has a provision that if children abuse their parents, they must be put to death. Now, that would obviously be very ancient and not to be followed. But remember that in the Ten Commandments, children honoring their parents and not committing adultery are listed. Same-sex sex is not listed in the Ten Commandments. So why the emphasis on same-sex sex and not on the other two? We have tried, as I said, with the religious people to put in a higher bar. So you can say things like, I would think that gays are going to hell, but you can't incite violence against gay and lesbian people. And
in terms of the religious objection, of course, there's a reverse side of that coin, which is about the long-standing traditions of tolerance that have been central to so many religions, Christianity not least of which. and presumably there have been other religious bodies that have supported this move for a more tolerant and equal society.
Yeah, no, the religious objections, I mean, Christianity, both Christianity and Islam and Judaism preach tolerance to a large extent. So it is not, it's not all religions, it's only a particular sector. You know, I've seen on the news that I think the Pope has, or the Vatican has said that same-sex couples can be blessed. So that's quite an advance that has been made. So, you know, it's an issue of, and maybe I'm being a bit naive, but why do people need to say, if you don't like the idea of gay sex, then don't have gay sex. But if other people want to, that's up to them. Leave them be. I mean, it's a bit like, and I think this is a bit like South Africa and the Immorality Act, where white people were forbidden to have sex with people from any other race. Now, okay, that was for particular reasons, but from the National Party regime at the time. But why do we want to go back to that, of checking in on people's bedrooms and things like that?
We're in conversation with Deputy Minister John Jeffrey on a very important piece of legislation that has made its way through Parliament, sitting on the desk of the President for signature. It's about the criminalization of egregious hate crimes and hate speech. And of course, in our country's long history of division, this is something that is central to promoting a more just and equal society. When we come back, we'll be in further conversation about international examples, where to from here, and what could some of the implementation challenges be. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing the Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill, which has made its way through Parliament and is on the desk of the President. Deputy Minister Jeffrey, we have been talking about the objects of this bill, some of the objections to it. Let's come to where to from here. Pepuda, one of the other pieces of legislation around discrimination and equality, spent a long period in the courts with the constitutional process around it. Are you concerned about a potential constitutional challenge to this bill? And do you think that it would withstand constitutional scrutiny?
Yeah, look, South Africans are very litigious, so I really think there will probably be a challenge, some or other challenge on it, whether it's a theoretical challenge or as a result of somebody being prosecuted, that remains to be seen. Obviously, there can't be any challenge until the President has assented to the bill, but that's possible. Obviously, the bill was checked firstly before it came to Parliament for constitutionality by the state law advisors. Then once in Parliament, it would be the parliamentary law advisors. So I'm fairly confident that it isn't unconstitutional. But yeah, I mean, people have different views. I read an interesting critique of the Kwelane judgment by an advocate, Ben Wicks. With him saying, look, that Kwelane got it wrong, or the judgment got it wrong. So everybody's got their own views. I mean, they often say you have like 3 lawyers and you've got 6 opinions.
Yeah, and in South Africa, probably 12 opinions.
Yeah.
Have you given thought maybe to the President directly referring it to the Constitutional Court to maybe bypass that process?
He can't. He's got to, I think the wording in the Constitution is that if he has concerns about the constitutionality, then he has to refer it back to Parliament or to the National Assembly specifically, NCOP, if it's something that's happened there regarding the procedure.
Right.
So he has to do that first, and then if Parliament doesn't address those concerns, then he can refer to the Constitutional Court, or then the President can refer to the Constitutional Court. But they can't test it. I think that used to be in the interim constitution, but it's not in the final constitution, and that's a process that has to be followed.
And when do you expect the president to sign? Obviously, it's within his power, but it's on his desk.
I don't know if it's even on its desk yet. There were a number of bills passed. This was only passed on the fourth.
Yeah.
Parliament then have to send it to the president. It would be evaluated by lawyers in his office, so it's not something that he just rubber stamps.
Sure.
It would be consideration. So it's difficult to say how long it would take. I would think this would probably be a bill that they would want to think about more than other bills.
Sure. And one can see the wide-ranging impact. One other aspect of the bill, we've spoken about a potential challenge, and we've seen in many instances in South Africa that minority interests can be powerful, and even powerful enough to sometimes subvert the intentions of legislation. One of the worries I had with the bill is what happens if those with access to power and money use this to defend minority privilege and start calling all kinds of things racist, which actually aren't racist, but subvert the objects of the bill in that way. Any thoughts on that possible strategy?
I think there's a real likelihood of that happening. The bill is not, it covers any form of, let's say with hate speech, any form of harmful things said. Let's take race, for example. It doesn't have to be against black people. It can be against white people.
Sure. It can be against men.
Yeah. So it could be used, but obviously I think the historical context becomes important. There was a case against Julius Malema on the issue of kill the boer, kill the farmer, which the Gauteng High Court found was not hate speech, looking at it in terms of the context, the historical context of those statements. I recently handed over the remains of a PAC activist who had been executed as part of the Gallows Project. And, it was handed over at a ceremony with the family and with the PAC, who were still using the slogan of one settler, one bullet. The Secretary General of the PAC explained to me that, look, this is not aimed at you, this is the historical context. So I think that does become important in how things are looked at. The Julius Malema case, I understand, is on appeal to the SCA. It may well have to go to the Constitutional Court. So that is a possibility. It may be more of a possibility in the years after the early years after the bill comes into law. Hopefully things will calm down after that.
Yeah. One objection I haven't heard actually vocalized from any quarter, but that I also wanted to put to you is creating harsher sentences actually the right way to dissuade this kind of action? And you have, of course, said this is not a panacea that's going to fix everything. But the question of equipping the NPA to get better at enforcing what's already there, the question of strengthening the criminal justice system might seem to some to be a more important imperative right now. What is it about the legal penalties that you think is doing important work in this bill? Well,
the penalties are a deterrent. So yes, it's important for the NPA to get its act together, and they are working on doing that.
Sure.
With the implementation of the bill, it's not just there's provisions for the National Director of Public Prosecutions to issue directives on particular aspects relating to the implementation of the bill. But as I said, this is definitely not the panacea. This is just one weapon in the fight against racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, anti-migrant sentiments, those kinds of things. More has to be done to promote people being more tolerant of each other. I'd also raise the problem that when it comes to race, I don't think we're going to be able to address racism properly until poverty doesn't have a black face and wealth having a white face largely.
Sure.
So those issues need to be addressed. But I think the key thing with the bill is you can't say something bad or do something bad and expect to get away with it.
And I think the reverse side of the coin for those who are critical of the bill is that there are serious crimes happening in the country. It's not as if this bill comes out of a vacuum and is intent on creating new problems. In terms of homophobic hate crimes, we've seen people dying, being abused in all kinds of ways, racial hate crimes, anti-Semitic crimes, and speech. We as a society still have deep problems. The tragic killings of people with albinism. We have problems in the society that actually need these interventions.
Yeah. And you mentioned anti-Semitism, which it's there for to deal with as well, but also Islamophobia.
Absolutely.
And for example, if you, whether it's a shul or a mosque, if you throw a brick at them, that's malicious injury to property, which is not such a serious crime, but if you can prove it was done because you don't like Jews or Muslims, then it becomes a hate crime.
And when you say the proof as well, I think it's important in the public debate for people to appreciate the bar that happens with a criminal case that this would be. This wouldn't be something where there's some doubt and it's a 50-50. We're talking about obvious, egregious crimes where there is very serious evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that the motivation was hateful.
Yeah. No, I mean, you've got to prove guilt beyond, in a criminal case, you've got to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. So there's got to be no reasonable doubt in the presiding officer, the judge or the magistrate's mind that this person is guilty. Sometimes you'll have in a criminal case where a presiding officer will say, look, I actually think you're guilty, but I can't discount your explanation for what happened. And they then get acquitted. So, it's going to be the courts that are going to be enforcing this law.
Indeed. We're in conversation with Deputy Minister John Jeffrey. We're talking about a very interesting, maybe under-discussed piece of legislation which has made its way through Parliament, which is about the prevention and combating of hate crimes, things like racial hate crimes or gender-based hate crimes, and hate speech. And the bill could come into operation soon after the President signs and assents to the bill. We're discussing the bill, its wisdom, some of the objections that have been raised to the bill and what it could mean for South Africa going forward. Stick with us as in the final segment of our conversation, we look to the future, implementation, what challenges are foreseen when the bill comes into force, and how we can ensure that these kind of egregious crimes against people's identities can get taken seriously in South Africa. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. The problem of serious hate crimes and hate speech has long dogged the South African political landscape, and a new bill, which has made its way through Parliament, would seek to impose harsher and some criminal penalties on these kind of acts if it can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt that crimes like this were motivated by prejudice. Deputy Minister Jeffrey joins us to talk about this. And in this final segment, I suppose the question is the future and the way forward and making sure that this act can be implemented once it comes into force. What are your thoughts around how this implementation can be most effectively achieved?
Yeah, the bill is not just the combating of hate crimes and hate speech bill, it's also the prevention of and combating of hate crimes and hate speech. So There are clauses dealing with trying to prevent hate crimes and hate speech, responsibilities on the Minister of Justice, responsibilities on some of the Chapter 9 institutions there to protect, Chapter 9 of the Constitution there to protect democracy. So that will also come into effect. Maybe just to say that the bill doesn't come into effect when the President assents to it. He would assent to it, and then a date would be set for its implementation, because
Sure.
there's a fair amount of work that has to be done in terms of the instructions from the police and the directives from the National Prosecuting Authority.
Right, right.
Then it would be implemented. But there are also other programs from government. So, one is the National Action Plan against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances, which is something that came out of the International or the World Conference Against Racism, which was in Durban some time ago, and said that countries needed to come up with these national action plans. We came up with one, and it's been a bit slow. There's a lot of preparatory work that needs to be done, but there is also that program. Civil society run programs against racism or other intolerances. There are other government programs, particularly from sports, arts and culture, on nation building.
Let's go a bit deeper into some of those components. What kind of responsibilities are placed on the minister?
Look, it's largely reporting to Parliament. Those are the responsibilities of the minister in terms of this bill, on steps that have been taken, as far as I recall, and the cases that have happened.
Sure. And in terms of civil society, which you mentioned, what kind of role have they played in bringing this bill about, and what's the role of civil society in implementation? I saw there were a number of groups that came together around this bill, which seem to have played quite an important role as well.
Yeah, there was the Hate Crimes Working Group, which is still there.
Sure.
They played quite a key role and they were a diverse group of different organizations. I would imagine that once the bill gets implemented, they will play a role in monitoring its implementation. But it is important for civil society also to look at programs to encourage tolerance.
One aspect of the bill, when I think about the future and its implementation, is people will actually have to report these crimes, and there's a lot in the bill about victims' statements and how those go into the way, I suppose, that the NPA would then prosecute the crime, and maybe how the judge would look at what has been happening. Talk us through the responsibility of people who are victims of these crimes, also bringing this to the attention of the state and ensuring that justice and accountability is seen.
Well, look, with the hate crimes element, sometimes the victim may not be alive. They may have been murdered. There is provision in the bill for victim impact statements, that basically the court must hear from the victim, and if they can't get a statement, they've got to explain why they can't to the court. So it's not something they can just brush over. There's provision whether the victim is deceased, that other people from the family or from the group that the victim belonged to can also testify about the impact of this crime on that particular group of persons. So that's also there, and that's also there if the victim doesn't want to testify. So if it's a homophobic crime, then people from organizations representing gays or lesbians can also testify in court.
And what about the NPA's role in this? Ultimately, they're going to be prosecuting these crimes, one would assume. And of course, the NPA is an autonomous organization. you have some dealing with them. What do you think their role would be in ensuring this bill, when it finally becomes an act, is implemented appropriately?
Look, as I'd said earlier, there's provision for the National Director of Public Prosecutions to issue directives to the prosecuting authority relating to when a case should be withdrawn or not proceeded with, to try and ensure norms and standards on it. There's provision for training of both prosecutors and police in dealing with hate crimes and hate speech. So one would obviously expect that to be done. One would expect, I think, the prosecuting authority to ensure that the cases where there is, well, it's their responsibility anyway. There's got to be a reasonable basis for expecting the case to succeed before you can actually prosecute. So I'm not expecting a huge plethora of hate speech cases. And I would imagine that the directors of public prosecution would look quite carefully at what are the elements, so this doesn't just become a piece of mud that's thrown at people.
Absolutely. We started, and it'll be interesting to also end here on some of the international examples of drafting these kind of different bills. I suppose there also must be some international examples of implementation, or what has happened when these bills have been implemented. Final thoughts on international practice that we can draw on as we try to meet international best practice with hate crimes and hate speech?
Yeah, well, I don't know if any one country has international best practice. Maybe just to say that there are certain treaties that South Africa has ratified. One of them is the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. We got recently reviewed last month on that. The comments from there's a committee of experts who evaluate states' performance, and they were calling for the implementation of this law, complaining it had taken so long. There's another convention on civil and political rights. Same thing. When we got reviewed, I think that was 2016. They were raising, where is this bill? Convention Against Torture. Same thing, and then our Universal Periodic Review, which was at the beginning of this year, a number of states raised their concern that we need to finalize this legislation. So internationally, in terms of the treaties, and those are three major treaties that I've mentioned, there's pressure to pass the bill. So we're doing what is internationally compliant, as it were.
So far from going against international practice, we, with this bill, are actually conforming with and actually rising to some of the challenges that have been put on us for not implementing this kind of legislation.
As I quoted from Justice Majid's judgment, international law both protects free speech but also calls for penalties for abuse. And so particularly in the Elimination of Racial Discrimination Convention, there's provision that states should particularly pass legislation preventing people preaching racial superiority. And in the Civil and Political Rights Covenant, there's a similar provision that religious freedom is protected, free speech is protected, but subject to states being able to legislate to prevent abuse. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't see that complaints that we're in violation of our international obligations really hold any water.
We've done a lot of technical discussion about this bill. We've looked at it from a number of angles, legally. Personally speaking, why do you think when we look historically at South Africa's position, where it is right now, where it's been, why do you think this bill matters?
Well, we are still quite an abusive society. I think on the race white South Africans before 1990 were particularly racist. Apartheid was founded on the basis of white superiority and black inferiority. That then all disappeared in the early 90s, and I think what one's seeing perpetually is that those sentiments are still there. Things become racialized in terms of problems in society, etc. Many white people put a racial element on that. So that's a problem. I think it's not surprising that that's there because of our history. So those people may not have been there, or adults in 1990, but they were brought up by parents who had those views and probably passed it on to children. Issues of, I think, a very vulnerable group currently, given the problems in the country, is our immigrants, particularly immigrants from the rest of the continent, or immigrants that are competing with less skilled South Africans for income, and they need to be protected. And then obviously luckily we're not too bad, I think, as a country on religious intolerance, but you don't want a situation where that starts getting out of hand. And then lastly, the sexual orientation aspect, we're moving ahead with that, improving as a country, but we need to ensure that incidents of homophobia are dealt with.
Absolutely. Well, we spend a lot of time criticizing government, rightly so, if I might add. But I think it's also important when important legislation like this comes out to highlight it and spotlight it, and to celebrate it in many ways, given our society. So Deputy Minister Jeffrey, thank you very much for joining us on Unfiltered to unpack this bill. Racial hate crimes and racial hate speech have no place in South African society, and a recent new bill could eliminate the problem, the gap in South Africa's legislation of being unable to deal frontally with hate crime and hate speech. Tonight we have inquired into that bill, looked at some of the objections to it and its possible implementation. Let's continue the conversation on social media at Unfiltered SABC. And thank you for joining us for another installment of Unfiltered Views, Unfiltered News, and Unfiltered Conversations. Have a good night.